I remember the way the ground used to tremble just slightly when the molasses tank filled. A low groan, like something ancient, shifting under the street. Most people ignored it. I didn't. I was just a dockhand then. 17, maybe 18, depending on who you asked and whether the foreman was checking papers that day. It came rushing down the street like a wall dark, glinting like amber in the sunlight, but heavier than anything I'd ever seen move. People didn't scream at first. They didn't have time. They just disappeared. Horses, wagons, children lifted and slammed like toys in syrup. One man's hat floated by before he did. That tank loomed over the north end like a second moon. Big, metal, ugly but ordinary. Just one of those things you pass every day until it becomes part of the background. No one expected it to explode. The strange thing is, the day didn't feel like it would become history. The morning sun was soft, almost spring-like for January. Kids were skipping across cobblestones, bundled in coats too big for their shoulders. I remember the smelliest and salt and coal smoke woven into the air like thread. The city never really sleeps, but that morning felt slow, almost gentle. A pause before something sharp. I had just stepped out of the bakery with a heel of stale bread when it happened. A sound like metal screaming, then silence, and then hell. It wasn't water. Water you can swim in. Water moves around you. This stuff grabbed. It swallowed. The tank had burst wide open, split like a melon, and the city was drowning in molasses. It sounds funny when you say it like that, like something out of a cartoon, but it wasn't. It was hot, sticky, deadly. I tried to run, but the wave caught my boots and sucked them down. I hit the ground hard. The air burned sweet and sour in my lungs. Every breath felt like trying to inhale through honey. I remember the way the sugar-coated my ear sounds came in slow and muffled, like I was underwater in a dream. Somewhere, someone was shouting a name. Might have been mine, but the molasses didn't care. It curled around everything: feet, wheels, fences, even voices. You, Dante, think about how thick grief can be until it takes form and wraps around your knees. I clawed at the cobblestones, but every time I tried to pull myself up, my hand slipped on syrup and blood. I think it's missing the ones who lived but never walked the same again. Like the man who lost his mother and never spoke after, or the girl who danced in her front yard the night before, but now just stares at windows like their eyes. Grief doesn't always die where the death ends. It lingers, gets caught under fingernails and stitched into blank. 4 weeks after, the air smelled of sugar and metal. Even now, sometimes when the wind hits the harbor just right, it comes back. I wasn't sure which was which. A plank from a wagon floated past me with a child's boot still tied to it. That's when the fear kicked in, not for me, but for everyone else. The horses screamed the worst. Their bodies weren't made for that kind of death. You could hear the sound of ribs breaking, lungs gasping, hooves skidding against cobblestone. A mounted patrol officer was thrown clear, but his horse wasn't. I watched its eyes disappear beneath the wave like two dim lanterns going out. The elevated train track groaned above us. I heard it twist along, metal sigh. One of the supports gave way, and a section of rail dropped, nearly taking out a fire truck that had just arrived. People were pointing, frozen, half sunk in syrup, unable to move or speak. No one had words for what we were standing in. By the time help really arrived, the scene didn't look real anymore. It looked like something from a fevered dream building shattered inward, streetcars on their sides, people glued to walls, literally glued. The molasses had started to cool and thicken. It stuck to everything: shoes, hair, lungs. I saw a man break a window to pull out a trapped boy, only for both of them to collapse from exhaustion before they could crawl free. There was a nurse who used her coat to wipe syrup from a baby's mouth, her sleeves stained dark as wine. I still wonder if that baby made it. The syrup covered up the sound of sobbing. There was no siren loud enough to organize the chaos. We worked on instinct. Some dug with shovels, some with hands, some with nothing but the will to try. A dog barked nonstop beside a collapsed wall. We listened. Underneath the wood was a woman, barely breathing. Her legs fused together by molasses, like wax dripping from a candle. We poured water on the ground just to loosen the muck. At some point, the firemen brought out steam jets. It looked like hell clouds rising from the streets, hissing, moaning, choking with sweetness and smoke. And still, that smells sickly sweet and endless. They say 21 people died, but I think the number is wrong. There wasn't a cleanup plan. How could there be? No one writes protocol for syrup-stained streets and grief-thick sidewalks. The city sent in wagons, buckets, mops, but nothing worked like the sea. Salt water from the harbor was pumped through pipes, flooding the area to dilute the molasses. It didn't wash it away, it just made it colder, stickier. Men used picks and axes on the hardened pools. By day 2, they were scraping molasses off brick with kitchen knives. A month later, the sugar was still in the air. The newspapers called it a molasses flood, like it was a punchline. They showed pictures: collapsed houses, dead horses, glistening sidewalks. But the photos didn't carry the sound or the smell. Blamed Italian immigrants, even though they were the ones who died. That the tank was too thin, that it had never been properly inspected. That money was prioritized over lives. The company was ordered to pay damages, $628,000, spread among hundreds of families. It wasn't enough. But it was the first time a corporation had been held accountable for something like this. Engineers began needing licenses. Structures began needing signatures. And buildings started being treated like they mattered. They pointed fingers at phantoms, but there were men who had warned them. Some buildings were rebuilt with red brick and iron reinforcements. Some weren't rebuilt at all. Families moved away. Streets changed names. The old molasses tank site eventually became a Park-Langone Park. Kids play soccer there now, never knowing what their cleats dig into. But some of us remember, not just the flood, but what came after. A strange kind of sweetness, born from horror. Complained about the leaks, the creaks, the stress on the rivets. They were told molasses couldn't hurt anyone, that it was harmless, that it was sweet, or the way the residue crawled into basements and hearts. I knew a man who lost his only brother that day. He never went near the North End again. Said it made his teeth hurt just walking past. People talk about trauma like it's a ghost, but it's more like syrup it sticks, even when you scrub. The lawsuits came fast, but the apologies didn't. The company United States Industrial Alcohol claimed sabotage. Said anarchists did it. It took years, 6 of them, for the courts to rule. It was negligence. Boston healed in pieces, not all at once. I used to think memory fades on its own, that you just get older and things slip away like fog in the sun. But this one stayed. Not as a picture, but as a feeling. The weight of sugar in the air. The way syrup stuck to the bottom of your lungs, long after the streets were clean. There are moments I still hear the tank groaning. Not really, but in the bones. Like it left a hum behind. A low, guilty hum no one could fully forget. Some people turned it into a joke over the years. Boston, home of the sticky street. Careful or you'll get molassecuted, they'd say. Not really. Most people never smelled what I smelled. Never saw that wave rise taller than the buildings. Never scraped molasses from their shoes for 3 straight months. There's a plaque now. Small, metal, plain. You'd miss it if you blinked. It says, more or less, that 21 people died here. It doesn't say their names. It doesn't say the syrup ran warm. And I'd laugh too. Sometimes, not because it was funny, but because laughter is easier than remembering. Played stickball in the alley behind the cannery. Smart mouth, quick feet. The syrup dragged him 2 blocks. His body was found days later, wrapped in fence wire like some awful gift. No one talks about him. No statues. No pictures. But he's in my memory, running across cobblestones with a ball made of rags. Laughing before the world turns slow. That's the thing with disasters, they grow softer edges over time. Maybe someone kissed their kid goodbye and said, "See you after work." Maybe a baker set down dough to rise, never knowing the oven would never warm. These are the things no one records. The almosts. The ordinary moments right before everything breaks. I carry those too, not out of guilt but because someone should. They get repackaged, made into trivia. You hear it in a bar. Hey, did you know a flood of molasses once killed people? And someone laughs through a sip of beer, like it's just another weird headline from long ago. I don't blame them. A boy I knew, his name was Salvatore, was only 10. Sometimes I wonder what it smelled like the day before the flood. Just a normal Boston morning. I once asked my father why no one stopped the tank from being built. He just looked at me and said, "Because it was money, son." Back then, alcohol for industrial use meant profit, and molasses was money waiting to ferment. People had doubts. Sure, they heard the creaks, saw the leaks, but when you're poor and your boss says it's fine, you keep your head down. We all did. And that silence, the one we kept to feed our families, it cost us more than we thought. Not because they're beautiful, but because they mattered. The world doesn't stop turning for molasses or memory, but I think, maybe, just maybe, we stop for each other. That's all history ever really is. Us. Deciding what's worth pausing for. After the court case, engineers had to get certified. Imagine that. It took drowning in syrup to convince the country we should double-check steel, how it can sweep up a grown man before he blinks. Speed isn't just about motion. It's about surprise. And molasses. It moves slow right up until it doesn't. It changed building codes across the U.S. It made inspection laws stronger, more thorough. Lives lost turned into lives protected, just not ours. I guess that's how a lot of change happens. After. Someone pays the price. After someone drowns in something no one believed could kill. People say molasses move slow. That's the joke. Slow as molasses. In January. But I saw how fast it can be. How it outruns horses. There are mornings when I walk to the harbor, and the air feels familiar. Damp. Sweet. Not in a comforting way, but like a ghost pressing its cheek against mine. The kind that whispers instead of wails. Sometimes I sit on the bench near where the tank once stood. It's a park now. Green, quiet, and I watch kids play without knowing what's under their feet. I don't stop them. I just sit and remember, because someone has to. Someone has to hold these stories the way you hold glass. Careful, quiet, respectful of the cracks. I used to think the flood was the strangest part of my life, but now I think it was what happened after. How quickly the world moves on. How newsprint yells, but pain doesn't. A man loses a child, and the city says, We're rebuilding. But no one rebuilds your arms, your dinner table, your dreams. We learned to smile again. Sure. But it was the kind of smile that only lasts for the length of a handshake. As if grief were a formality. As if molasses doesn't leave stains. Years later, they built new tanks stronger. Certified double riveted, they said. I worked construction for a while, helping weld the skeletons of safer things. Every time I touched a steel plate, I wondered if someone would someday die because of it. I know that sounds grim, but when you've lived through failure, you don't forget what failure looks like. It's not just crack sits, quiet warnings ignored. It's the way a manager avoids your eye when you say, "That doesn't sound right." It's trust, buried under red tape. I welded like someone was counting on me, because someone always is. The flood became myth in the papers. Boston's stickiest day, the sweet tragedy. I hated those headlines. As if syrup made it softer, as if sweetness canceled sorrow. But people like tidy stories, and molasses makes for great metaphors. Heavy streets, my legs move like they're wading through honey, but my arms are light. I'm always reaching for someone I can't quite pull free. Always just 1 second too late. And when I wake, my hands still smell like molasses, even after all this time. Writers love to compare grief to slow-moving syrup, but I know the truth. It was fast, violent, merciless. There's nothing poetic about lungs full of sugar. I met a woman years later. Her name was Elena. Her brother died in the flood. She said her mother never baked again. Couldn't stand the smell of brown sugar. I asked her why she still lived in the North End. She said, because the ground remembers him. That line stuck with me, like a nail beneath the floorboards. Quiet, but sharp. Some nights I dream in amber. There was a man I knew named Frank, worked the rails back then. He was up on the elevated tracks when the wave hit. Fish died, crabs disappeared. Even the gulls stopped coming for a while. The sea couldn't clean itself fast enough. Just like the people. We all got stains, some on our clothes, some on our hearts. That's the thing they did. Some ran and made it. Some didn't. Some didn't know what they were running from until it was too late. It's easy to judge a flood when you're standing on dry land. But when the streets rise up beneath your feet, instinct becomes your compass. You don't think you move, or you don't. And either way, the syrup doesn't care. And when it rained, the scent came back. Not fresh, not rotted. Thick, said the metal shrieked like a banshee, buckling right beneath his feet. He jumped clear, landed hard, broke 2 ribs, but lived. Years later, he'd tell the story at the bar like it was a fishing tale. Molasses tried to take me, but I was too sour. He'd laugh, but then his eyes would drift, and he'd go quiet for a while. Not all survivors walk away whole. Some just learn to carry the cracks better than others. They say Boston Harbor stayed brown for months after. The molasses bled into the bay, staining the water like spilled ink. My boots from that day never came clean. I tried everything steam vinegar, even kerosene, but they stayed sticky. I kept them anyway. Put them in the attic in a box I never opened. Some things you don't throw away, not because they're useful, but because they're proof. Proof that you were there, that you lived through something others can only imagine. I think that's what most of us really want to be remembered by, what we endured, not just what we survived. People from out of town sometimes ask, why didn't they just run? There was no memorial service, not right away. Too many funerals, too many names. Some families held mass in kitchens, still sticky with syrup. Others just lit candles and whispered to photos. The city was too busy blaming, building, moving forward, but those of us who stayed, we remembered. Sent men in at night to scrape their name off the wreckage. I don't know if it's true, but it feels true. And every street I walked felt like it had been dipped in memory. If a rivet had been tighter, would 21 people have lived long, ordinary lives? Would Elena's brother have opened a bakery? Would Salvatore have played stickball until his knees gave out from age? Not syrup? These are the thoughts that visit you when everything else goes quiet. What might have been, what should have been, and what never got the chance. Even the corners that hadn't been touched by the syrup. Trauma doesn't need geography. It just needs a door left open in your head. In mine, that door creaks every time I hear a thick liquid hit pavement. That's the thing about trage effect and myth. Stick together like sugar and ash. What's remembered isn't always what happened, but what stays is always what mattered. That's the only rule I've learned. Not with plaques, but with glances. A silence shared over tea. A hand resting too long on a cracked window. Years later, they started doing walking tours. I stood behind a group once, listening to the guide. He joked about Boston's stickiest mystery, called it a sweet disaster. People chuckled, took selfies. I didn't say anything, just kept my distance. He wasn't wrong, it was a disaster. But sweet is for memories that don't ache. This one still does. I heard a rumor once that the company tried to quietly dismantle the tank before the lawsuits hit. I worked odd jobs 4 years after the flood, moved bricks, painted porches, shoveled snow until my shoulders cracked. You know, sometimes I wonder what would have happened if the tank held. If someone had inspected it, somewhere in a file cabinet, there's a folder stamped with the case number, all the testimonies, the engineer's reports, diagrams of a tank that was never meant to hold that much pressure. I've read them once, years after it all. Structural failure, insufficient safety margin, thermal expansion. All true, but none of it sounds like screaming. What doesn't make it into the record is how we looked at each other afterward. A little longer. We all had some version of survivor's guilt, even the ones who didn't lose anyone. We lost something, trust, maybe, or the idea that safety was the default setting. Like putting it on paper would make it too real again. There's a difference. Heroism is what the nurses did, what the firemen did, what the mothers did, pulling children from sticky debris with bare hands. Me? I just kept breathing, even when the air was heavy with sweetness and sorrow. But now, I don't know. I'm older, slower, and memories are starting to drift, so I speak them instead. Tell the stories when someone asks, because if I don't, the syrup wins. That if something big was built, someone must have checked it first. After that, every creak meant something. Every puddle under a pipe became a warning. Every silence carried weight. One winter, I saw a boy skating near the old Site Longoni Park, where the tank used to stand. He slipped, fell, and laughed. Just laughed. The sound of it hit me like a wave. That place had held screams once. Now it held joy again, and I didn't know how to feel. Part of me wanted to shout, "Don't you know what happened here?" But another part of me thought, maybe this is how places heal. Some survivors kept journals. I never did. Maybe I was scared of writing it down. People always say, "You lived through that," like it's a badge, but I don't feel heroic. I just didn't die. There are days when it all feels like a dream. Like maybe the flood never happened. Maybe it was just some strange parable passed down through dock workers and grandfathers. They know about tea in the harbor, but not sugar on the street. And I get it. It doesn't fit the kind of history we teach. No presidents, no battlefields, just broken steel and broken families. But that doesn't mean it's not important. If anything, it matters more. Because it shows how ordinary things, syrup, greed, silence can become catastrophic, and how ordinary people carry the cost. But then I step outside and smell molasses from a bakery, and my body tenses before my brain catches up. So we don't ignore the groaning tanks in our own time, whatever they look like. Now bridges, policies, systems that strain under pressure. There's always a warning. Salvatore with his rolled up sleeves in perfect baseball stance. Frank still telling that same joke at the bar. The nurse with her syrup-soaked coat. None of them wanted to be remembered this way. But I remember them anyway, not because they died, but because, for one awful moment, we all lived through the same impossible thing. And we helped each other float. Always a whistle before the rupture. But someone has to listen. Someone has to speak. And someone else has to believe them. That's how you stop the next wave. Trauma doesn't ask for permission. It rewires you in ways you don't notice until years later. A sound, a smell, a glint of sun, off something brown and moving. And suddenly, I'm back there again ankle-deep in syrup, reaching for a stranger's hand. You'd be surprised how many people have never heard of it. I don't tell this story to scare anyone. I tell it so we remember. I don't have children of my own. Life didn't line up that way, but if I did, I'd take them to that park. Show them the patch of grass where molasses once ran 6 feet high. And I'd say, right here, the world stopped being simple. And maybe they'd laugh, or roll their eyes. But they'd remember. And if they ever heard groaning steel, they might listen just a little harder. When I close my eyes now, I don't see the wave first. I see the faces. Elena's brother, barefoot and grinning. There was a man from the newspaper who came by years after the flood. Said he was writing a retrospective Voices of the North End. It's written by editors, and editors like clean lines. They don't want syrup on their pages. They want timelines, bullet points, lessons. But this story doesn't work like that. It clings. It spreads. It seeps into the corners. And no matter how you try to clean it up, something always gets left behind. He had a notebook, a tape recorder, and a smile to clean for someone talking about death. I told him everything. He nodded politely, scribbled furiously. But when the article came out, it was all numbers. You wouldn't notice unless you were looking, but I do. With more caution. Sure, but also with more care. Neighbors paid attention to the things we'd ignored before. Leaks, groans, strange silences. And we started to ask questions again. That might have been the real change. That quiet shift from trust to responsibility. They're the ones that soaked up the most sugar. You can power wash a wall, but you can't undo time. I think those bricks remember, just like I do. Not every place that holds trauma looks haunted. Some places hide it in plain sight. Smiling parks, silent sidewalks, molasses beneath the roots, 21 dead, 2.3 million gallons spilled. Cleanup took weeks, no names, no faces. That's when I realized history's not written by survivors. I went to a museum once. They had a model of the tank. A child tapped the glass and asked his mom, "Is that where the chocolate came from?" She laughed and said yes. And I stood there, stunned. Because part of me wanted to correct her, and part of me wanted to let the kid keep that version. The sweet one. The safe one. Maybe that's what healing is, letting some people see chocolate while you carry the truth. There's still a part of the North End where the bricks are darker. Some days, I wonder if the flood made us better. Not in the moment, but in what came after. People looked at each other differently. I had a neighbor, Mrs. D'Angelo, who lost both her sons that day. She never talked about it, but every January 10th, she'd light 2 candles on her windowsill and leave them there until the wax curled into itself. Said if you pressed your ear to the soil, you'd hear bubbling. Kids make up stories, sure, but I always wondered if maybe, somehow, the ground was speaking. Places that carry pain often echo in ways we don't understand. We call it superstition, but really it's memory. Carried not in stories, but in silence. And sometimes, even silence can scream. No plaque, no words, just light. You could walk by her house and never know it was a shrine. But we knew, everyone on the block did. Something bigger, with names, with faces, with context. City council kept shelving it, budget issues, shifting priorities. He never gave up. Sent a letter every year. Same date. The anniversary? I met him once, outside City Hall. He handed me a copy of his proposal, paper folded to softness, said, "We remember, or we repeat." That's how grief lived here, quiet, steady, never needing to be explained. Some kids used to dare each other to visit the old tank site at night, said the ground still whispered. Fossilized sugar. They say it's probably still there, deep in the soil. Scientists even drilled samples once. But to me, that molasses is more than sediment. It's story, it's stain. It's a reminder that even the softest things can crush, and even the sweetest things can drown. There was one old man who spent decades trying to get a proper memorial built, not a park. There's something about molasses people don't talk about. It ferments. If it sits too long, it turns sour, toxic, and sometimes, I think memory is the same. If we bury it without air or space, it rots, turns bitter, spills over later in ways we don't expect. That's why I keep telling this story. Not to relive it, but to release it. To keep it from souring in the dark corners of the city. Somewhere under all of the cinder, the bricks, the grass, the decades is a layer of hardened sweetness. I used to wonder why I survived. Out of all the names in the newspaper, mine wasn't one of them. I wasn't heroic. I didn't save anyone. Families scattered, new shops opened, tourists came. Sweet and awful, heavy and hollow. It doesn't come often. Just enough to remind me. Enough to take me back. Enough to prove it happened. And that I'm still here, holding the memory like a jar sealed too tight. No one walks the street thinking about syrup. Except me. And maybe 1 or 2 others if they're still alive. We don't need signs to remember. We have skin. I didn't run into the flood, I just didn't get caught fast enough. In door frames. Asked why I sat on the same bench every week. I told her I was waiting for the past to settle. She wrinkled her nose and asked, "Does it float?" I said no. Then, maybe it already has. She smiled, skipping away. I sat there, stunned. Because maybe she was right. Maybe it had floated through me, through all of us, and we just hadn't noticed. In basements. In the earth. That's the thing about history, it doesn't go away. It just gets absorbed. It lives in shadows. In the spaces between things. Unseen, but present. Survivor's guilt is a strange thing. It doesn't shout, it hums. Low. Constant. Like a tank under pressure. Some days it's quiet. Some days it's louder than anything else. People moved on, of course. They always do. The cannery was rebuilt somewhere else. The molasses hardened over time. Just like the city, it crusted, cracked, was scraped off brick and wood, but pieces remain. Once a little girl came up to me in the park. Even now, when the wind is just right, I smell it. That old, strange scent, heavy and hollow. It doesn't come often. Just enough to remind me, enough to take me back, enough to prove it happened. And then I'm still here, holding the memory like a jar sealed too tight. The years kept coming, one after another, soft as snow. The streets changed. So did the people. But the bones of the city stayed the same. Cobblestones, lampposts, the curve of the wharf. I used to think I'd leave, start somewhere clean. But I stayed. Maybe out of stubbornness. Maybe because this place knew me in a way no other place could. It remembered when I didn't want to. One spring, decades after, they planted trees near the tank's old footprint, saplings at the time. Now they tower. Their roots dig into soil, soaked in sugar and sorrow. People picnic under them, read books, propose marriage, all while sitting atop one of the strangest graves in American history. I think the trees know. I think their rings hold our story, tight and sweet. Nature has a way of recording things we forget. I once saw a tour guide get it right. Not just the facts, but the feeling. He spoke softly. Told the group about the wave, the children, the cleanup. And when he finished, he said, they didn't just survive, they rebuilt together. That word stayed with me, together, because that's the part people miss. We didn't just mourn, we mended. Not because we were brave, but because we had each other. There's something sacred in shared sorrow. Something that stitches people tighter than joy ever could. We helped each other scrape molasses from floorboards and from dreams. We lent boots and bread. We told jokes when crying got too loud. And slowly, the neighborhood became a neighborhood again. Not because the city made it so, but because we refused to let the sweetness win. Grief didn't drown us. It taught us to float. I don't expect anyone to build a statue. That's not what this is for. The story doesn't need marble. It needs remembering. In quiet ways. In whispered warnings and small kindnesses. In listening to groaning tanks whatever they may be in. Choosing not to ignore them. If even one person does that because they heard this, then the syrup didn't win. The flood didn't win. We did.
There's a kind of wisdom that only comes after the wreckage, when there's nothing left to fix but yourself. When the noise is gone, and all you have is the silence. And you realize the silence isn't empty, it's full. Full of every choice, every warning, every voice you didn't hear in time. That's what Boston became to me. A city humming with second chances. Not perfect, not proud, but awake. And sometimes that's enough. I never wanted to be part of history. I just wanted to make it home for dinner. But history doesn't ask your permission. It just shows up dripping with sweetness and takes what it takes. And you either get swept away or you find a way to swim. That's the lesson I hold on to. Not just for me, but for anyone listening. If it sounds like something's cracking, ask. What? If it smells too sweet, and if someone says it's nothing, don't believe them. The flood was one day, but the remembering has lasted a lifetime. It's in every January breeze, in every shift of the foundation. You don't get over something like that. You just learn how to walk with it, like a limp in the soul. But I walk anyway, because the world is still beautiful, still worth rebuilding, even after everything. And maybe especially after everything. I think of Elena sometimes. How she smiled when she said, "The ground remembers it." I think of the trees now rooted where the tank once stood. And I wonder if they've grown sweeter. If somewhere deep in the bark is a hint of that day, maybe history doesn't disappear. Maybe it just keeps growing in memory, in muscle and molasses and marrow. If I could bottle this story, I would. Not to sell, not to preserve, but to hand to someone when they say, "I don't understand how things can go so wrong." I'd uncork it and let them breathe it in, the sweetness and the sorrow, because both are real and both belong in the telling. That's why I'm still here, on this bench, beneath the branches of what used to be a tank.
Maybe this bench is my way of bottling it, not the disaster, just the remembering, the weight of it, the stillness, the way the air hums a little different here. Some people need museums, others need plaques. Me, I just need this spot, the quiet, the shade, and what's buried beneath both. I've come to believe not all floods are made of water. Some are made of time, of memory, of the slow, creeping truth that we've built too much on what we hoped would hold. And when it gives when, it breaks it, leaves behind more than wreckage. It leaves the chance to build better, slower, smarter, with ears open, with hands ready. Somewhere, a new tank. Somewhere, someone says, "It's fine." Someone else says, "It's always done that." And someone who should be heard goes quiet, because they don't want to be a problem. We've seen where that leads, and we've cleaned up after it. So maybe the real story isn't about syrup at all. Maybe it's about listening, before things spill. A friend once told me every city has ghosts, not the kind that rattle chains, the kind that walk beside you in daylight, that shape the air around familiar corners, that hum when no one else hears it. This city's ghost is sweet, sticky, warm, and heavier than most, but it never really left. The flood didn't care who we were, rich or poor, young or old. It just moved, fast and full and final, but we cared about each other. That's what saved us. In the end, not the cleanup, the kindness. The cleanup took weeks, but the healing took years. Some wounds you don't see, like the way a man crosses the street to avoid the old cannery, or how a mother flinches at the smell of brown sugar. We rebuilt what we could, buried what we couldn't, and lived with what was left. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. I sometimes think about the syrup that never got cleaned, the parts soaked so deep they became part of the foundation. Invisible, but there, like old grief, or love that never found its words. Not everything needs to be seen to be real. Some truths just sit quietly, holding weight, holding space, waiting for someone to remember. The hardest part wasn't the day it happened, it was the days that followed. When the streets were quiet again, when the molasses hardened into something we couldn't outrun, when the world expected us to move on. But we did, not all at once, not the same way, but together, slowly. Like sugar dissolving in tea. There's a plaque now, finally. Small, easy to miss. Just a few lines carved in metal near the park. Most people walk past it without stopping. But I stop. I touch it not to remember because I never forgot, but to say, you're still seen. That's all any of us really want, isn't it? To be seen. To be heard. To not be swept away by something sweet and terrible. To know someone will speak our name after we're gone. That's why I tell this story. Not for pity, not for praise. Just so the syrup doesn't win. Just so the silence doesn't get the last word. I don't tell this story because it's mine. I tell it because it's ours. Because it belongs to the hands that shoveled, the feet that ran, the voices that shouted through syrup. It belongs to the ones who were lost, and the ones who still carry their names. You can forget the date, you can forget the numbers, but don't forget the sound the city made when it cracked, or the silence that followed, or the people who stood in that silence and chose to stay. There's a boy who sits on this bench now, doesn't know me, doesn't know the story, but he brings his lunch and feeds the pigeons like it's sacred. Like he knows, somehow, this place matters. And maybe that's enough. Not every lesson needs a headline. Sometimes it just needs a bench, and someone willing to listen. I've lived a long time, long enough to see the Sira become a symbol, a metaphor in essays and textbook. But before it was that, it was real, it was sticky, and it stole breath from lungs. So if someone ever tells you, it's nothing, remember this. Remember the tank, remember the wave, remember that even sweet things can collapse, and take the world with them. Molasses is heavy, but stories are heavier. They stick to you, cling, resist washing off. They follow you through generations, and if you're lucky, they teach you how to hold them gently. This was mine. One story in a city full of them, but it mattered, and it still does. Especially now, with you holding it to. So if you're standing on old ground, and the wind smells sweet paws, ask what happened here. Ask who was lost, and who remained. Ask what we learned, and what we ignored. That's how you keep a city honest. And maybe, just maybe, that's how we stop the next flood, before it comes.